Welcome, everyone. Our topic this week is to explore what was changing in the United States during the 1920s, a decade where America's past and America's future were in clear conflict with each other. And as always in history, from great conflict comes major change. The progressive reform spirit had ended with the domestic unrest that followed World War I. Politicians platformed for a return to normalcy. Corporations sought to escape the eye of government regulations. In many ways, the political economy of the 1920s is reminiscent of the Gilded Age. What distinguishes the 1920s from the Gilded Age are two major aspects, though. First, the explosion of entertainment as big business propelled by new technologies like the radio and motion pictures. Second, whereas in the Gilded Age, the major conflict we saw was one between labor and management, in the 1920s, conflict came to a head in almost every aspect of society, from gender to race to religion to immigration. Many people might look back at the 1920s and romanticize the Great Gatsby party scenes of the Roaring '20s. But what lied beneath that glitz and glamour was an unstable society resting upon an extremely unstable political economic system. The big picture we want to understand here is that in the 1920s, a popular national culture significantly grew in influence in American society for the first time. However, at the same time that popular culture phenomena such as movies, radio shows, and professional sports seemed to unite society, intense debates increased over the effects of this culture on public values, on morals, and national identity. The modernism of the future would collide against the fundamentalism of the past. Let's examine business and culture in the US, as well as the business of culture in the US. It was in this era where a very unimpressive President Coolidge famously said that the business of America was business. This is clearly seen in the business doctrine of three successive Republican presidents during the 1920s. Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover. They hoped all would forget the regulatory spirit of the progressive decades and instead return the U.S. to the laissez-faire approach of its government towards business. Government was meant to support business growth, not curb it with health, safety, and wage regulations. The 1920s decade is also referred to as the Jazz Age. Jazz music, the term white people gave to black improvisational music, is brought to northern cities by black musicians thanks to the Great Migration, and it becomes the symbol of a new culture. The movie industry soars, talkies, movies with sound, begin in 1927, and also we see the beginning of sports celebrity in the United States during the 1920s. Regarding gender roles, family, and education, patriarchy still reigns in the 1920s. But a revolution in morals erupted. The flapper became the symbol of the new rebellious woman. Divorce laws were more liberalized, and 25% of young adults graduated from high school. And that was a huge increase. There was a literature of alienation in the 1920s. The lost generation, disillusioned from World War I, disillusioned with income inequality, racism, and fundamentalism in America. And at the same time, there was a celebration of black art and black culture called the New Negro Movement, also known as the Harlem Renaissance. Again, this was a focus on the artistic achievement of black artists in this period. Poets, musicians, artists, writers, dancers. More about the conflict now. In the 1920s, we really see the values of America in conflict. The 19th century America against the new 20th century America. First off, in the 1920s, we see that most people try to forget about progressivism, and the political economy returns to a Gilded Age capitalism. Other conflicts, religion, modernism versus fundamentalism, modern science versus a biblical idea of science, We see this most clearly in the famous Scopes trial. This was an example of how Southern states tried to outlaw the teaching of science, and especially evolution, in schools. Prohibition. The 18th Amendment banned the sale and manufacture of alcohol. This was a way to try to legislate morality. Temperance movement had succeeded. It will last for 14 years, although it will also lead to an increase in organized crime as gangs try to control the distribution of alcohol. The 1920s is a time period of increased xenophobia and nativism. Quota laws begin in the 1921 and are expanded in 1924. This set a racist limit on the number of immigrants from different countries. The quotas were set high for countries like England and Sweden and France, but the quotas were set very low for certain undesirable groups from Europe: Jews, Russians, Italians. The quota was set at 0 for all of Asian countries and African countries. During this time period, though, Mexican labor was still relied upon, and the farm work in California and in Texas, so Mexicans and Central Americans were exempt from the quotas. Also, in the 1920s, we see the birth of a new Ku Klux Klan, the rebirth of the Klan. They said there was 5 million members in 1921, and the Klan was not just in the southern states. It was in California. It was in the North. The state with the largest number of Ku Klux Klan members, it was said, was Indiana. Another important development in the 1920s was the birth of Black nationalism, most notably in the work of Marcus Garvey and his United Negro Improvement Association. Black nationalists and Marcus Garvey advocated for individual and racial pride for blacks. They said the new Negro has no fear. Furthermore, Black nationalists called for separatism and economic self-sufficiency within the Black community. And there was even a Pan-African movement known as the Back to Africa movement, which encouraged Black Americans to leave the United States, to move to Africa, and start a nation of Africans. At this time period, we can see that nationalism had swept through Europe, and the idea that all different ethnic groups deserved their own country. Well, that also influenced leaders like Marcus Garvey, the idea that Africans deserved their own country, the continent of Africa. Another important development, as mentioned before, was the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance, or the New Negro Movement, was a name given to the cultural, social, and artistic explosion that took place in Harlem, New York City, between the end of World War I and the middle of the 1930s. During this period, Harlem was the cultural center for Black writers, artists, musicians, scholars, etc. So what are the biggest changes we see in America during the 1920s? Here are some important examples. The 1920s is the beginning of the most restrictive period of immigration laws in our country's history, the quota system. These laws were so restrictive that they actually won the admiration of people like Adolf Hitler in Europe. The new woman steps out into the public sphere, directly challenging traditional patriarchal gender norms. Women were cutting their hair, showing their shoulders, wearing jewelry, smoking and speaking in public, taking jobs in the city, seeking out independence. The Great Migration of thousands of Black families continued in this time period. Families who were escaping segregation and terrorism in the South. They'll move to northern cities and find a new way of life, but will confront institutional racism there as well. There's a backlash against new immigrants, new women, and the new promotion of Black culture and entertainment. All of this leads to the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, which extended beyond just southern states. Politically, the 1920s resembles the Gilded Age much more than it resembled the Progressive Era. And for foreign policy, after World War I, many people believed the United States' involvement in the war had been a mistake. So the U.S. returns to an isolationist foreign policy, withdrawing from European affairs for the next 20 years.